I've been a trucker for over 20 years, driving America's highways from coast to coast. I've faced all kinds of weather and seen things that would make anyone question their sanity, but nothing compares to what happened one rainy night in Nebraska on the I-80. It had been a smooth drive until then. The radio crackled, and the rain pounded against the windshield, making the road almost invisible with the thick fog that had suddenly rolled in. Anyone familiar with this route knows how treacherous it can get, especially on the darkest of nights. I was on the stretch between North Platte and Kearney, a place I always thought was peaceful with little traffic at that hour. Suddenly, through the fog, I saw the headlights of a small car parked right in the middle of the road. There was no sign of life, no brake lights, nothing. My heart raced, and all I could do was swerve, yanking the wheel hard to the right. The truck shuddered like never before, and I felt the wheels lose control as the weight of the load dragged me. Everything happened in seconds. The truck tipped over, and the sound of twisting metal and shattering glass echoed before everything went silent. I woke up in the hospital, my body aching and covered in cuts, but miraculously without any serious injuries. The doctor said I was lucky to have survived that crash, but I couldn't stop thinking about the car. Who would leave a vehicle like that in the middle of the road? The strangest part was that the police never found any sign of another car at the scene. They said maybe due to the trauma, I imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. I saw those headlights, as clear as day. A few days after leaving the hospital, I started noticing something strange at night. Always around 3 in the morning, I would wake up with a heavy feeling in my chest, like someone was in the room with me. And it wasn't just a feeling. I could see a shadow on the wall, a figure standing at the foot of my bed. At first, I thought it was just the medication or the stress from the accident. But each night, the presence became clearer, and I started noticing more details about this figure. He was wearing a hat, like those truckers wear, and his expression was stern, as if he wanted to tell me something. One of those nights, the figure finally came closer. I felt my body freeze, sweat dripping down my face as I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then he spoke. "You swerved to avoid me," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "I died on that curve 20 years ago." Terrified, I could only listen. He told me that he had been a trucker too, and on a night much like mine, he tried to avoid a car on the same road, but wasn't as lucky as I was. His truck went off a cliff, and he didn't survive. Ever since, he'd been stuck on that stretch, trying to warn others like me. After sharing his story, he simply vanished. The light in the room returned to normal, and I could move again. I sat there on the bed, trying to process what had just happened. A nurse came in shortly after, saying I looked pale, like I'd seen a ghost. Little did she know how right she was. I never saw him again after that night, but the feeling that something bigger is going on along that highway never left me. I went back to driving, more cautiously than ever, and I always think about what he told me. Maybe I was the only one to hear him, but I'm sure I'm not the only one to have experienced something strange on that road. Every now and then, when I pass through, I see the crosses by the roadside, reminders of how many lives have been lost on that stretch. And although I don't talk about it with many people, something tells me the souls trapped there are always trying to reach out to those willing to listen. We were on our way back from a weekend in the mountains. Ethan, Sarah, and I decided to take a shortcut, which seemed like a good idea at the time. The GPS showed an isolated road that cut a good chunk off our drive back home. And since it was already late, we wanted to get back as quickly as possible. The road was completely deserted, lined with trees that loomed like dark shadows on either side, with a thin mist rising as we drove further. At first, it was just a feeling of strangeness, something none of us wanted to talk about, but the tension in the car only grew as we continued down that stretch. As we drove, the silence became heavier. The jokes and conversations that had filled the car earlier faded away. Something in the air felt wrong. The atmosphere was thick, almost suffocating. Then, in the middle of the road, deep in that darkness, we saw something that froze our hearts, a woman. She stood there, motionless in the center of the road, her head lowered and her body hunched over, wearing old, dirty clothes. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Stop the car." "What is that?" "Ethan, who was driving, slowed down, but instead of stopping completely, he tried to swerve around her. As we got closer, she suddenly lifted her head, revealing a horribly deformed face, with eyes completely vacant and a twisted, nightmarish grin that sent chills racing through our veins. In a panic, Ethan yanked the wheel to avoid her, but the car skidded off the road, coming to a violent halt. The engine died immediately. The tension inside the car was suffocating. "What the hell was that?" Ethan whispered, his voice shaking with fear. None of us had an answer. I suggested checking the engine, since it didn't make sense for the car to break down like that. Sarah was fidgeting, staring out the window, muttering something about not being alone. But being the rational one in the group, I forced myself to get out of the car, despite the overwhelming fear creeping down my spine. As soon as I stepped out, the feeling of being watched hit me like a punch. I looked around, but the fog enveloped everything, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The trees seemed to close in around us, as if the environment itself was alive, trapping us. While I checked the engine, I heard branches snapping in the nearby forest. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I saw them. Figures. Human-like shadows moving between the trees, fast and silent, watching, getting closer. I ran back to the car, my heart racing. "There's something out there. They're surrounding us," I said, trying to stay calm. Sarah began quietly sobbing, while Ethan, in desperation, kept trying to restart the car, but it was no use. And then things got even stranger. A low, guttural voice began to fill the car. At first, it was a whisper, something hard to understand, but it grew louder and louder, until it was clear it wasn't any of us. Sarah, her eyes wide with terror, slowly turned toward Ethan, and to our horror, he was muttering something in a language none of us recognized, his eyes glazed over and his face pale. "He's possessed," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Ethan began convulsing in his seat as that demonic voice echoed through the car. The air around us grew heavier, almost suffocating, as if even the atmosphere was against us. The shadows outside crept closer, indistinct figures but clearly threatening, surrounding the car like predators. For a moment, I thought it was the end. We were trapped, surrounded by these entities, with Ethan under the control of some dark force. Sarah trembled beside me. Fear etched across her face, and I knew there was no easy way out. But then, something happened. As suddenly as they had appeared, the shadows began to retreat. Ethan stopped muttering, the demonic voice fading away. The car's engine, which had been dead until that point, suddenly roared back to life. Without hesitation, I pulled Sarah into the car while Ethan, still dazed, slammed on the gas. We sped away from that road as fast as we could, the sound of the engine cutting through the night as the shadowy figures disappeared into the mist behind us. We drove in silence for a while, too shaken to speak about what had just happened. We knew, somehow, that we had narrowly escaped something far worse than we had imagined. We never took shortcuts again after that, and that road became a topic we avoided at all costs. Some things, after all, are better left in the past, buried along with whatever it was that chased us that night. It was supposed to be a quiet trip. I was driving home after a long, exhausting weekend, alone on a deserted road somewhere in Utah. It was late at night, and the weight of fatigue was heavy on my eyes. I decided to stop at one of those roadside rest areas to catch some sleep. The place was completely empty, save for one or two distant cars. It seemed safe enough, so I pulled over, turned off the lights, and decided to use the bathroom before trying to nap. The rest area was eerily quiet, only the occasional sound of the wind slicing through the cold night air. As I entered the bathroom, I felt a strange unease, but I brushed it off. It was your typical roadside bathroom, poorly lit and a bit grimy, but functional. I went into the last stall, locked the door, and tried to focus on getting through the stop quickly so I could continue on my way. That's when I heard heavy footsteps enter the bathroom. At first, I didn't think much of it, but soon the steps stopped right in front of my stall. The silence that followed was unsettling. Suddenly, the door to my stall rattled violently, as if someone had slammed into it. My heart jumped and I tried to stay calm, thinking it might just be some drunk or someone messing around. But then the person on the other side started slamming their head against the door over and over while yelling something unintelligible. The muffled sounds echoed through the confined space. The force of each blow made the whole stall shake. I froze. For a few seconds, I had no idea what to do. The man's voice was distorted, full of rage or, worse, madness. He kept smashing his head against the door, and I could hear his heavy breathing between the shouts. Every impact made my heart race faster. I needed to get out of there, but how? He was right outside. Then, in a moment of pure instinct, I realized the only way out was to make a run for it. I gathered my courage, unlocked the door in one swift motion, and shoved it open as hard as I could, hitting the man on the other side. He stumbled back, and I seized the chance to escape. I caught a brief glimpse of him as I passed, and what I saw sent chills through me. His face was covered in cuts, and his eyes. There was something deeply unsettling about them, like he was completely out of his mind. I ran without looking back, his screams still echoing from the bathroom. When I reached my car, my trembling hands could barely find the keys in my pocket. The fear that he was right behind me pushed me to act faster than I thought possible. I finally managed to start the car, and as I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw him running out of the bathroom, still charging toward me, arms raised, yelling something I couldn't understand. I floored the accelerator, tearing out of that rest stop as fast as I could, leaving the man and his madness behind. My whole body was shaking, and the terror of almost being trapped in that bathroom with him was overwhelming. Even miles down the road, I couldn't calm down. The silence of the highway, once comforting, now felt threatening. I haven't stopped at a rest area at night since. No matter how peaceful or safe they may seem, you never know what, or who, might be lurking nearby. That night taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Sometimes danger hides in the most unexpected places, and all you can do is run as fast as you can when it shows itself. If you're enjoying the stories so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us. We'd love to hear it. Now let's dive into the next story. I've always been the kind of person who carefully plans things. But that night, as I was driving back from a friend's house, I made a mistake I'll never forget. I was driving down a back road near Flagstaff, Arizona, when I noticed the gas gauge was dangerously low. It was late, and the road was practically deserted. No houses, no lights, just the beams from my headlights cutting through the seemingly endless stretch of asphalt in front of me. I was alone, and the silence was unnerving. When the car finally sputtered and came to a stop, I realized I'd have to walk to the nearest gas station, which fortunately was less than a mile away. I grabbed an empty gas can I always kept in the trunk and started walking. The only sound I could hear was my own footsteps and the wind rustling through the trees. After about 20 minutes, I reached the station, which was nearly deserted, except for a bored attendant behind the counter. I filled the can as quickly as I could, feeling a growing sense of unease. Something about that night felt wrong, but I tried not to think about it. The walk back was even more tense. Every sound seemed amplified, and the darkness around me felt oppressive. I just wanted to get back to my car and leave. When I finally saw my car on the shoulder, I felt a wave of relief. But that relief quickly turned into a chilling terror. Someone was standing next to my car. A man, average height, wearing a dark jacket. He was just standing there, motionless, as if he had been waiting for me. My first instinct was to stop and watch from a distance, but he quickly noticed me and started walking in my direction. I froze for a second, unsure of what to do, but he waved and called out, like he was asking for help. My car broke down nearby. "Can you give me a ride?" he said, with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. The problem was, I had just walked that stretch of road, and there hadn't been any other cars around. My heart started racing. Something about the situation didn't add up. I didn't know what to do. He was only a few yards away now, insistent, trying to get closer to the car. "Come on, I just need a quick ride. My car's just over there," With each step he took, my nerves got worse. My mind was racing, searching for a way out. I knew giving him a ride would be the worst decision of my life. I told him I couldn't, that I was in a hurry, and kept trying to pour gas into the tank, keeping an eye on him. That's when he moved toward the driver's side window, and with a much darker tone, he said, "Just roll down the window. I just want to talk." His hands were now pressed against the glass, and I saw the glint of something metallic in his hand. It looked like a blade, a knife, or something sharp. My breath caught in my throat. I had to think fast. He kept knocking on the window, insisting, and I knew if I opened it, that would be the end. In a moment of pure instinct, I turned the car on while he was distracted, tossing the gas can into the back seat. I slammed on the accelerator, tires screeching as I sped away, my heart pounding uncontrollably in my chest. In the rearview mirror, I saw him try to chase after me for a few yards before disappearing into the darkness. The adrenaline kept me alert, but soon I realized something was wrong. The car started making a strange noise, like something was scraping against the body. I didn't know what it was, but the sound seemed to be coming from the back. I kept driving until I reached a busier area, where I finally felt safe enough to stop and check what had happened. When I got out of the car, I saw deep scratches along the side, as if something sharp had been dragged across the metal. It was like it had tried to slash the tires or damage the car as I fled. After that night, I avoided that road for a long time. The feeling of being followed, of being watched, never fully went away. I don't know what that man had planned, but I know I was lucky to have escaped that night. I often wonder how he knew I would be there alone, in the middle of nowhere. Maybe he was waiting for anyone who happened to pass down that deserted road. But one thing I do know, I'll never underestimate the danger of being stranded in the middle of the dark again. It was one of those nights where all we wanted was to unwind. Me and 3 friends, Jake, Brandon, and Lisa, decided to hop in the car and drive aimlessly, just enjoying the freedom of the empty roads around Colorado Springs. No plan, no destination, just the wind in our hair and loud music to keep us awake. We were laughing, talking about anything and everything, when we noticed something strange. 2 headlights were quickly closing in on us in the rearview mirror. At first, we didn't think much of it. It could have been anyone driving late at night. But as the cars got closer, something about the aggressive way they were following us made everyone uneasy. At first, we tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just a coincidence, right? But when the 2 cars started positioning themselves, one on each side of us, blocking any attempt we made to get out of the way, we realized the situation was much worse than we had thought. I was in the passenger seat and saw when one of the cars got so close to ours, it looked like it was about to collide. Jake, who was driving, began to tense up, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "What the hell are these guys doing?" he shouted as the car on the right swerved dangerously close, trying to force us off the road. Panic started to set in. Brandon, in the back seat, was yelling at Jake to speed up, while Lisa, next to me, fumbled for her phone to try and call the police. The problem was, we were in the middle of nowhere with no signal, and the fear that something worse might happen was only growing. The 2 cars kept pushing us, their headlights blinding, as if they were hunting us. Every time Jake tried to speed up or switch lanes, they'd react, making dangerous moves and forcing us to the edge. I could feel the car shaking as Jake did everything he could to keep control. We were going over 80 miles per hour, and it felt like at any second one of the cars would send us flying off the road. The roar of engines around us and the screech of tires on the asphalt made the tension unbearable. No one was talking anymore. It was just heavy breathing and the fear etched on everyone's faces. And then, like a stroke of luck, we saw the lights of a police cruiser parked on the shoulder, just a few hundred yards ahead. "There! The police!" I shouted, pointing frantically. Jake slammed on the gas, trying to reach the cruiser before the 2 cars could catch up to us. As we passed the police car, the flashing lights came on, and for a moment, everything stopped. I looked back, expecting the cars to follow us, but instead, they just vanished, like they were never there. The relief was instant, but the fear was still pulsing through our veins. We pulled over to the shoulder, and the police cruiser pulled up behind us. The officer approached, and we explained the situation as fast as we could, still in shock. We described the two cars and how they had been chasing us. The officer frowned, like he'd heard this kind of thing before. He called for backup on the radio and asked us to wait while he checked the area. By now, we were exhausted, hearts still pounding, but we finally felt safe. We sat there for a few more minutes, until the officer returned with a serious expression. He told us that the cars we described matched the vehicles used by known criminals in the area. What had seemed like a random chase had actually been much more dangerous than we realized. These guys were already wanted for several crimes, including robbery and attempted murder on other highways. The officer said that thanks to our report and the accurate descriptions we gave, they were able to arrest the group a few hours later in a neighboring town. When we finally got home that night, none of us spoke. No one wanted to talk about what might have happened if we hadn't spotted that police car in time. The feeling of relief was replaced by a persistent unease, like the road would never feel the same to us again. We never went out for a late-night drive with no destination after that day. Because sometimes, danger isn't something you can predict or avoid. It just appears, out of the darkness, without warning. And all you can do is hope you escape in time. Traveling for work had become routine for me. The long, lonely roads through the Arizona interior were just part of my daily life. One of the few things that broke up the monotony was Miguel's taco truck, always parked in the same spot at a rest stop by the highway. Every time I passed by, I made sure to stop. The tacos were amazing, and Miguel, the owner, always had a smile and good conversation. It had become part of my routine, a small refuge amidst the solitude of the roads. But that night, something was different. I arrived at the spot as usual, already imagining the delicious smell of grilled meat and the warmth of the food after hours of driving. But as I pulled in, I noticed the truck was eerily quiet. The lights were on, but Miguel was nowhere to be seen. I found it strange, but I tried not to worry right away. Maybe he'd stepped out for a minute, I thought. Yet the silence around me was unsettling, and I began to feel a discomfort I couldn't quite explain. As I got closer to the truck, I smelled something strong burning. It wasn't the mouth-watering aroma of grilled meat, but something bitter, almost nauseating. I walked up to the grill, which was still on, and saw something burning, completely charred. My heart started racing. I called out for Miguel a few times, but the only response I got was the crackling of the flames. Something was very wrong, and that uneasy feeling quickly turned into pure fear. With trembling hands, I decided to climb into the truck to see what was going on. The door was slightly ajar, and the interior light flickered as if it were malfunctioning. I stepped inside cautiously, the burnt smell growing stronger. The inside of the truck was a mess, nothing like the neat setup Miguel usually kept. Papers were scattered everywhere, and the cash register, which he always kept tightly locked, was wide open. The money was gone. My stomach churned. I moved closer to the grill to see what was burning. That's when I saw something I'll never forget. Amidst the flames and smoke, something stood out, completely charred a hand. It wasn't a trick of the light or a mistake. It was a human hand, with blackened, twisted fingers scorched by the fire. The shock paralyzed me for a moment. My entire body froze, unable to process what my eyes were seeing. A wave of cold terror washed over me. I bolted out of the truck, the cool night air hitting my face as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. My legs trembled, and my heart was racing so fast I could barely breathe. I knew I had to do something, so with shaky hands I pulled out my phone and called the police. The wait felt like an eternity. Every passing second heightened the sense that something horribly wrong had happened there, and I was right in the middle of it. When the police arrived, they quickly cordoned off the area. I explained what I had found, still in shock. They investigated the truck, inspected the grill, and searched for more evidence. But as the investigation went on, the mystery only deepened. There was no sign of Miguel anywhere. No trace, no clue as to where he might have gone. It was as if he had simply vanished, leaving behind only that horrifying scene. Days passed, and the investigation continued, but with no concrete answers. The police questioned me several times, wanting to know if I had any more information, but all I could tell them was what I had seen that night. Miguel, the man I had known for so long, who always served me the best tacos, was gone. No one knew what had happened, and the few clues they had led nowhere. The uncertainty was overwhelming. As the weeks went by, the story began to spread through town. Everyone was talking about what had happened at the taco truck. Some said Miguel had been the victim of a robbery gone horribly wrong. Others, more superstitious, whispered about old stories from the region, legends of mysterious disappearances. But nothing made sense, and no theory explained what I had seen with my own eyes that night. The taco truck never returned. The spot where it used to park remained empty, a dark reminder of something no one could explain. Every time I passed by on my trips, I couldn't help but look over at the place, a chill running down my spine. The image of that charred hand was still burned into my mind, and the feeling that something much darker had happened there haunted me constantly. The police eventually closed the case due to lack of evidence. Miguel was never found, and the investigation became one of those unsolved mysteries that fade into time. Despite that, I never could forget. The memory of that night haunted me, especially during my lonely drives on the road. It was impossible not to think about what might have happened to Miguel or what had led to the horrifying scene I had stumbled upon. Even after all this time, I still wonder if there was something I could have done differently. Maybe I should have arrived earlier or paid more attention to any signs of danger. But in the end, I know there was nothing I could have done. The mystery of Miguel's disappearance, the taco truck, and that charred hand remains unsolved to this day, an enigma with no answers. The fear I felt that night changed the way I viewed my travels. The roads, once quiet and predictable, now seemed to hide dark secrets. And that little taco truck, which used to be a safe haven, had become a symbol of something far more disturbing. Sometimes, what seems like just another stop can turn into a nightmare you can never escape. Since that night, I've never stopped at roadside food trucks again. The trauma of that night made me avoid anything that reminded me of that place. Whenever I see something similar, a wave of anxiety washes over me. Some nightmares are too real to forget, and for me, Miguel's taco truck will always be the worst of them. Every time I drive down that same road, I still glance over to the spot where the truck used to be, half expecting, though not wanting, to see something or someone there. But the space remains empty, as if frozen in time. A constant reminder that some mysteries are never solved and some answers are simply out of reach. My friends and I decided to take a road trip through the remote highways of Washington State. The plan was simple: drive without a set destination, explore isolated landscapes, and camp when we found a spot that caught our eye. We were excited to get away from the city and all the hustle of daily life. With the car packed with supplies and music pumping us up, it seemed like the perfect weekend. However, the solitude of those roads soon began to have a strange effect on us. The vastness of the dense forests, along with the heavy silence, created an unusual atmosphere. After hours of driving, we decided to stop at an isolated rest area. There was no one else around, and the place seemed frozen in time. We parked the car and got out to stretch, enjoying the fresh air of the surrounding forest. There was something both charming and unsettling about the stillness. The rest area was small, with just an old public restroom and a few picnic tables, all covered in moss. We decided to explore a little further, leaving the car behind as we walked along a narrow forest trail. After a few minutes, we stumbled upon something unexpected: an old cabin, nearly hidden among the trees. The weathered wood and dirty windows indicated that the place had been abandoned for a long time. It looked like something out of a horror movie, isolated and forgotten. My friends and I exchanged curious but nervous glances. There was something about it that drew us in, as if we needed to see what was inside. We decided to cautiously approach. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as we pushed it open. The smell of mold hit us immediately as we stepped inside. The interior of the cabin looked as old as the outside, with broken furniture and dust covering everything. But something caught our attention right away. In the corner of a table, there was a stack of photographs. At first glance, they seemed random, but as we picked them up, the horror hit us. They were photos of us, Our clothes, our faces, everything indicated that these photos had been taken during this very trip. The shock paralyzed us. The photos were recent, no doubt about it. Some looked like they had been taken from inside our car as we drove, others from the rest area just minutes earlier. Panic set in when we realized that we hadn't seen anyone around all day. "Who took these photos?" one of my friends asked, his voice trembling. The silence of the forest around us felt even more oppressive now. We decided it was time to get out of there as fast as possible. We ran out of the cabin, hearts racing and minds reeling. We didn't bother closing the door or trying to make sense of what had just happened. We just wanted to get back to the car and leave that cursed place. The path that had once seemed calm now felt much longer. Every sound in the forest made our hearts leap, and the sensation of being watched grew stronger with each step. Finally, we saw the car and scrambled inside as quickly as we could. Ethan, who was driving, hurriedly started the car, and we took off. Inside the car, everyone was silent, trying to process what we had just seen. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and our heavy breathing. But as we drove down the dark road, we noticed something strange in the sky. Bright, silent lights began to appear above us. At first, we thought they were stars or planes, but the lights moved erratically, following the car from a distance. The lights, a bright white, floated in the sky, sometimes disappearing, only to reappear a little further ahead. No matter how fast we drove, they seemed to stay with us. I watched from the window, trying to make sense of it, but the growing sense of fear was undeniable. Ethan, already on edge, started to speed up, desperate to outrun those strange lights. But no matter how fast we went, the lights followed us relentlessly. No one could speak. Panic consumed us, and every second in the car felt like an eternity. The lights in the sky made no sound, but their presence was overwhelming. Sarah, sitting in the back seat, started crying quietly, her eyes fixed on the lights outside. The tension in the air was suffocating. It felt like something even worse was about to happen. We all kept glancing nervously at the sky, hoping those lights would vanish once and for all. We drove for miles, trying to put distance between us and those lights. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and the silence inside the car was almost unbearable. Finally, after what felt like hours, the lights began to disappear. One by one, they faded into the darkness, leaving only the starry sky above us. The tension inside the car eased a little, but the fear still lingered. Whatever those lights were, it seemed they had left us alone for now. Eventually, we reached a small town where we pulled over to catch our breath. No one wanted to talk about what had happened. We were exhausted, both physically and emotionally. We parked at a gas station and, for the first time in hours, felt a small sense of safety. Even so, the feeling that something had been following us didn't fully go away. I looked up at the sky, hoping the lights wouldn't return. Thankfully, the sky was clear, with nothing unusual in sight. We briefly discussed what we should do next. Someone suggested we report it to the police, but we all knew no one would believe us. Who had taken our pictures and why? And what were those lights? Nothing made sense. We decided it was best to move on and leave it all behind. But deep down, I knew that episode would stay with us forever. That forest, the cabin, the photos. They were mysteries we might never solve. For the rest of our trip, we didn't stop at any more isolated places. The road felt less frightening now that we were near more populated areas, but no one could fully relax. I felt like somehow we were still being watched. Every car that passed by seemed suspicious, and the darkness around us still felt threatening. Whatever that was, it had left a mark on us that we wouldn't forget. We arrived home the next morning, all of us exhausted and still in shock. Each of us went our separate ways without saying much more. The few words exchanged were brief, almost mechanical. What we had experienced was too real to ignore, yet too strange to fully comprehend. To this day, we avoid talking about that trip. It was the last time we ever decided to take shortcuts through deserted roads. My wife, Melissa, and I were driving through the Arizona desert on a long overnight trip. It was late, and the road was deserted. the horizon lit only by the car's headlights and the endless darkness surrounding us. The drive was smooth despite the exhaustion. We decided to stop at a 24-hour diner we spotted in the distance, one of those small rest stops in the middle of nowhere with a flickering neon sign. It was the only place open in that vast emptiness, and hunger was beginning to creep in. We pulled into the empty parking lot, with just an old pickup truck parked off to the side. The place looked abandoned, except for a faint light coming from the kitchen. "Maybe they're still open," Melissa said as we turned off the car. We walked into the diner and placed our order, 2 burgers and fries. The place was eerily quiet, with only the distant sound of a country song playing on the radio. We grabbed our drinks and returned to the car to wait for our food, keeping the air conditioning on to fight off the oppressive desert heat. While we sat in the car, with the windows rolled down, we heard an unexpected sound. Someone knocking on the driver's side window. My heart skipped a beat. I looked outside and saw a man standing there. At first glance, he looked ordinary, simple clothes and a worn-out cap. "Your tire's flat," he said, pointing to the back of the car. I was confused since I hadn't noticed anything wrong during the drive, but I thanked the man and told him I'd check it out. I got out of the car and walked over to the tires, expecting to see something wrong. Melissa got out too, worried. We carefully checked each tire, but they were all perfectly fine. No sign of a flat, no air leak, nothing. That's when I realized the man had disappeared. He was no longer in the parking lot. I looked around, expecting to see him near the diner or by the pickup truck, but he had vanished completely, as if he'd never been there. We got back into the car, trying to process what had just happened. "He disappeared so fast," Melissa said, her voice laced with unease. "Do you think he went into the diner?" We decided to go inside and ask the staff if they had seen the man. When we reached the counter, the tired-looking waitress stared at us with a puzzled expression. We asked her about the man who had warned us about the tire, but she seemed genuinely confused. "Nobody's come in here besides you two," she said, glancing at the security monitor. Curious and a little scared, we asked if we could see the footage from the security cameras that covered the parking lot. The waitress was kind enough to show us what we'd asked for. On the screen, we could clearly see our car parked in the lot, but the man, he didn't appear in the footage at all. We watched the moment when we got out of the car to check the tires, but there was no sign of the man who had knocked on our window. A deep discomfort settled in. How was that possible? Melissa and I exchanged nervous glances, the fear growing in our chests. Everything was there on the footage, just checking the tires, but the man who had warned us simply didn't exist in the recording. "Maybe it was just the light or something," the waitress suggested, trying to reassure us, but we knew it wasn't that. The man had knocked on the window, spoken to us, and now it was as if he'd never been there. The situation was becoming more bizarre by the second. We decided to grab our food and leave as quickly as possible. We paid for the burgers, thanked the waitress, and got back into the car. The parking lot, which had seemed merely empty and quiet before, now felt sinister. We drove back onto the highway, but the feeling that something was wrong stayed with us. We kept trying to rationalize what had happened, but nothing made sense. Who was that man? And why had he disappeared without a trace? The deserted road felt longer and darker than before. The shadows of the mountains on the horizon seemed to shift as we passed, and the silence around us was now oppressive. I tried to focus on driving, but my mind kept racing back to what had happened at the diner. "Do you think he was trying to distract us?" I muttered, more to myself than to Melissa, but she was just as shaken as I was, lost in her own thoughts. Hours dragged by until we finally saw the lights of a town in the distance. The relief was palpable, but the mystery of that night still hung over us. When we pulled into a hotel to rest, we were both exhausted, physically and mentally. Even then, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image of that man standing by the car, knocking on the window, and the fact that he hadn't appeared on the cameras. It unsettled me deeply. The next morning, when we woke up, we tried to talk about the previous night, but neither of us could come up with an explanation that made sense. The questions kept piling up. Was he real? And if so, why hadn't he shown up on the cameras? We tried to continue our trip, but that strange event stayed with us the entire way back home. The mystery of that unknown man became one of those unsolved experiences that would forever remain a question mark in our lives. To this day, whenever Melissa and I tell this story to friends or family, we're met with skeptical looks. Some people think it was just a result of exhaustion or a simple mix-up during a long night. Others believe the man was real, but somehow evaded the cameras. But deep down, Melissa and I both know that what we experienced that night wasn't normal. Arizona, with its vast desert landscapes and lonely roads, holds secrets that may never be uncovered. Now, every time we stop at a roadside diner, I can't help but think back to that night. I still wonder who that man was and what he really wanted from us. Whether it was a warning, an attempt to help, or something more sinister, we'll never know. What remains from that experience is the unsettling realization that, on certain nights in the darkness of deserted highways, the inexplicable can happen, and sometimes it leaves more questions than answers. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out 9 Scary Deep Woods Horror Stories by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.